Hello there, good evening. Thank you so much for joining me. A lot to get to this evening, including the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I'll speak with Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, who is in Kiev, for the latest on that. Also, the new Conservative leader, Pierre Poilievre, unveils his new shadow cabinet. I'll speak with a member of that shadow cabinet, who's also an Alberta Conservative MP, about that coming up. Plus Alberta Premier Danielle Smith, who was sworn in as Alberta's new premier. What should we make of the relationship between the federal government and the province of Alberta? Well, I asked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau about that earlier today.
Wyatt, next question.
Good afternoon, Prime Minister. Premier Danielle Smith of Alberta, who was just recently elected as UCP leader, spoke to media yesterday. She did say some quite controversial things, and she spoke a little bit about the relationship between your government and the government of Alberta, how she thinks that might change under her leadership. I'm wondering what you foresee changing, perhaps, in the relationship with the federal government under this new premier.
Thank you. It's great to see you, Wyatt. Our approach on working across the country with premiers has always been consistent in that we are there to deliver for Canadians that need help and support. We're there to grow the economy. We're there to fight the rising cost of living. We're there to develop the solutions that are going to lead to good jobs and good careers as we fight against climate change and grow the economy. And I'm looking forward, as I said to Premier Smith when I spoke to her just a few days ago, I look forward to work with her on a range of things that I know Albertans expect us to work together. Obviously, there's things we disagree on, but my focus will always be on the things that Canadians tell me are their priorities. Making sure they can put food on the table, making sure they have good jobs that'll take them not just through the next year, but the next decades. Make sure there's opportunity for their kids to grow up in a healthy environment with good careers. These are the things that are priorities for Canadians in Alberta and right across the country. And those are the things that I'm looking forward to working with Premier Smith and all premiers on.
Plus, I'll speak to this political expert who will weigh in on that. Also, ongoing recovery from Hurricane Fiona. I'll speak to this Atlantic Canada MP who is also minister responsible for the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency coming up. And also the ongoing concerns surrounding COVID-19. What can we still do to protect ourselves? Where are we at in the fight against this virus? Health Canada's Chief Medical Advisor, Dr. Supriya Sharma, will join me. That's all ahead on the program tonight. Joining me now for the latest on the ongoing war in Ukraine is Canada's ambassador to Ukraine. Ambassador, thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks for having me on the show, Wyatt.
Let's just start out with the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine. I mean, it's been ongoing now for many, many months. What do you make of how various countries, including Canada, have responded to the ongoing war?
Sure, thanks. That's a great place to start. Russia invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February. Ukraine didn't provoke this. It was a full-scale invasion along a large part of the border that Ukraine has with Russia. And since that moment, and in fact, for 8 years now, Canada has been supporting Ukraine as it fights a war with Russia. Because even before the full-scale invasion that now occupies a lot of our time in the news cycle, Russia invaded in 2014. Russia illegally annexed a big isthmus piece of Ukrainian territory called Crimea and the Black Sea, and a chunk of eastern Ukraine that we call the Donbass. And then we were helping Ukraine fight the war. And since the big invasion, we've been helping in three really, really big ways. First, weapons. Providing the Ukrainians with the weapons that they need to defend themselves, and then to launch these counteroffensives to get Russia off the land that it has now illegally occupied. The second way is we're training Ukrainian troops. We've already trained 33,000 in the last 6 years, 33,000 Ukrainian troops. We're continuing to train them. We can't do it in Ukraine anymore, so we're doing it in the United Kingdom. Another way we're helping them is with humanitarian assistance. What does that look like? Beds, blankets, food, money, so that people can go to market and buy themselves food if it's available. All that stuff that people need when their homes are destroyed, when they've had to leave their homes and flee, or when they're trying to go back into their towns and villages after they're liberated. So really, really important work that Canadians are doing here, and that Canadians back home are supporting strongly.
And I mean, as it relates to, you did mention and you alluded to some cities that have been liberated. When you look at not just Canada's response, but NATO's response, do you think it really has been adequate to the extent that Ukraine needs it to be, or that Ukraine wants it to be?
That's a really good question. And certainly that's when we talk to Ukraine, is they're always asking for more. Well, first they say thank you. They say thank you for everything because we're able to keep fighting because you support us. And then they say, and we need more. And they say that to their partners and to their allies. So is there more that can be done? Absolutely. We are in constant contact at many levels, Canadians and Ukrainians, and in coordination with the United States, with the United Kingdom, with the Netherlands and France and Germany and all our partners, to make sure that together we can figure out how to get Ukraine what they need. We all have different things. We all have different capacities. Some of us are close by, some of us are far away. So one of the things that Canada is doing, actually, all this equipment that countries are giving needs to be moved to Poland so it can be driven in. And we have really big airplanes that can move that stuff. And so we've got 3 airplanes that are always moving equipment from other parts of Europe and elsewhere closer to Ukraine so that it can then come in. That's just one example of how we coordinate with all of our allies to get Ukraine everything it needs.
And then just lastly, I mean, like, what do you foresee needing to happen in this ongoing war to at least make Russia not necessarily pull out, because it doesn't seem as if they're going to be doing that anytime soon, but to at least bring some sort of a ceasefire, at least bring some sort of sense of normalcy to Ukrainians?
So that's another really, really good question. And it's a bit of a complicated answer. And it starts with us saying to Ukraine, us and all of our allies saying to Ukraine, you guys get to decide when this is over and on what terms it is over. And Ukrainians right now are saying, we're not stopping until we have every inch of our territory back and all the people that live in those places are free again. So that's the first thing. Ukraine gets to decide. Now, how they get Russia off their land and out of the country is about the military counteroffensive and the equipment that Ukraine needs to do that. But there are also other ways in which Russia needs to realize that it is not worth it for them to do this. Russia needs to pay a high cost. We need to sort of change Russia's and Vladimir Putin's calculation about what he's doing here. And so that's where you probably hear a lot about things like sanctions, where we're going to try to isolate Russia economically so that they can't build more weapons, so that they can't bring money into their budget so that they can build more weapons. Isolate them with sanctions, make it as costly as possible for them to be doing this. We also have to make sure they know that they will be brought to account, that there will be justice for those, for the victims that have suffered at Russian hands. And that means that there need to be criminal trials for the people who make the decisions. There need to be criminal trials for the people who carry out the atrocities against Ukrainians. And there need to be criminal trials for the people who sit at the very top and are conducting all of the illegal stuff that Russia is doing in Ukraine right now. So that's all about raising the costs for Russia to do this and make them think twice about how they're behaving, and maybe even convince them that they just need to get out.
Okay, Canada's ambassador to Ukraine, thanks so much for making the time. Really appreciate it.
Wyatt, thank you again for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Thank you. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre unveiled his new shadow cabinet today. Among some of the people in the shadow cabinet, people such as Jajraj Singh Holland, who will become the party's new finance critic. Nova Scotia MP Dr. Stephen Ellis will take over as the party's health critic. Notably not in the shadow cabinet, people like Michelle Rempel-Garner, Ed Fast, Aaron O'Toole, who had requested to not be in the shadow cabinet. One of the people who is in the shadow cabinet is the new Treasury Board Shadow Minister, Stephanie Kusie, who is with me now. Stephanie Kusie, thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you very much for having me, Wyatt.
Stephanie, why don't we just start out with your role in Shadow Cabinet Treasury Board and more of a kind of an overall look at what this new Shadow Cabinet means as to how the Conservative Party will move forward and do what the opposition is supposed to do, which is ultimately hold the government accountable.
You're absolutely correct, Wyatt. And I see this new role that I have received from Pierre Poilievre, and I'm very grateful for. We have so much talent in our caucus. It's really an honor to be chosen. But I see it as very integral to holding the government to account, because it is this role that does the review of things such as the estimates, as well as the reports from the auditor. And there are certainly some very interesting things coming up, given that we are exiting the pandemic environment. So I think in short order, we can see topics such as the CERB, a review of how this major program was handled or possibly mishandled. We're seeing a lot in the news lately about the Arrive Can app, the amount of money that was spent on it, and that other similar applications have been created for 1/50th of the price. So I think that this is a fantastic job and is very integral to holding the government to account, because it's really an opportunity to take a magnifying glass, to go over the programs, over the initiatives, and see where there was competence. And in many cases, I think we're going to see where there was incompetence.
And I mean, over the past few weeks, really ever since the last federal election even, and since Pierre Poilievre has been chosen as the Conservative leader, a lot of talk about the rising cost of living, but more specifically, you and your party, the Conservative Party, have been talking a lot about saying how you believe the government will increase taxes. I'm wondering, I mean, why you believe that, and what ultimately do you have as evidence that the government is to do that?
That's a great question, Wyatt. And I think it comes down to inflationary spending. We're just seeing this government spending completely out of control. With the recent bills C30 and C31, budget 2022 is now at $56.5 billion. And really, it begs the question, was all of that money spent as well as it could have been? Were all of those programs necessary? And they have been done more efficiently and in a more cost-effective manner? Because really, we're talking about the money of hardworking Canadians who, as you have mentioned, are really stretched at this time in this cost of living crisis. So in this role, as I said, I think it's integral to a piece to holding the government to account, because it's ultimately the government spending that I will be reviewing, which has a significant impact on the cost of living for Canadians.
And I mean, you mentioned the government spending and you know, some of the things in the last federal budget as an example. Does it not concern you that perhaps if some of this government spending was not in place, you know, throughout the pandemic, then perhaps Canadians wouldn't be in the position that they are today? In other words, do you think the spending that the government offered to businesses, Canadians across the country, do you not think that I guess, played a role in ensuring that Canadians could keep their heads up throughout the pandemic?
I think the Conservatives had a very good place of goodwill and understanding of the unique situation that we were in the spring of 2020 and even going forward. And I had great compassion for my citizens in Calgary-Midnapore, including businesses. And that's why I set up the Calgary-Midnapore Economic Recovery Board during the pandemic. But I also think that there comes a point where we have to evaluate, and the time is now, as we are exiting the pandemic, for lessons learned, if things could have been done more efficiently, if things could have been done more cost effectively. I don't doubt that there were programs that were needed throughout the pandemic as we began our recovery, but this time has passed, and now every dollar that goes towards inflationary spending is really a dollar on the backs of Canadians who are already suffering.
Okay, Conservative MP Stephanie Kusie. Stephanie Kusie, thanks so much for making the time.
Thank you, Wyatt, for having me.
Alberta has a new premier, Danielle Smith, the former Wild Rose leader who was elected as the province's new premier through winning the leadership of the United Conservative Party of Alberta. That obviously follows her predecessor, Premier Jason Kenney, stepping down from the role after winning just over a majority in the party's leadership review. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau also touched on the relations, how that may change today between the federal government and Alberta at his press conference in Pickering, Ontario. Joining me now for the latest on all of that is political expert Lori Williams. Lori, thanks so much for making the time.
Great to be with you, Wyatt.
Let's just begin with that piece I mentioned. What do you foresee as perhaps changing in the relationship between the federal government and Alberta under this new premier, Danielle Smith? Do you foresee her as someone who is willing to work collaboratively with the federal government?
Well, I think we're likely to see pragmatism kick in. After all, there are things that are being offered by the federal government that would be good for Albertans. And I think there will be pressure on Premier Smith to work with the federal government for the benefits that are being offered. So, for example, we're talking about dental care, just as we saw with childcare. Jason Kenney was willing to work with the federal government, make some demands, negotiate for a better deal, but nevertheless to accept the offer of services that a lot of Albertan parents wanted to take advantage of. Similarly, I think we'll see things like dental care and strings attached healthcare monies, things like that will probably continue to benefit Albertans and, of course, be claimed as wins by both the federal and provincial government. On other files, it's just not as clear. Danielle Smith is already saying that she wants to go to court again to challenge the carbon tax, and is claiming that she is going to restrict the application of the firearms buyback program by directing the RCMP. Apparently, she thinks under the contract that Alberta has with the federal government that this is something that she can coordinate here. The reality is the police, RCMP and local police, Calgary Police Service, Edmonton Police Service, and so forth, enforce the criminal code. And so if this is part of the criminal law of Canada, I'm not sure that that's something she'll be able to do. And I think in some respects, both she and the Premier of Saskatchewan are claiming that the federal government is threatening things that it in fact isn't. It's not going to enter people's homes or vehicles to take away firearms. It's a buyback program. There aren't any environmental police, as is being claimed by the Saskatchewan Premier and by Danielle Smith. So I think hopefully some of the rhetoric will tone down and perhaps negotiations on what they can agree on and what will be good for Albertans will carry the day.
And I mean, when you look at something like, say, the Alberta Sovereignty Act that Premier Smith is proposing, as one example, she's not in the legislature yet, and that by-election, she said, won't be happening until around the end of November, which means that this so-called Alberta Sovereignty Act wouldn't be able to be implemented for at least the next few months. What do you foresee that as having an impact on? Do you think it will have an impact? And if so, what might that be?
Well, it's difficult to tell at this stage because Danielle Smith has said very different things about what might be in that act. So she's talked about refusing to enforce federal laws in Alberta. For the most part, the federal government enforces its own policies, its own laws, and so forth within a province. Doesn't ask the provincial government to do that for them. And the sort of challenge to federal interventions under the Constitution, I think, it's not at all clear what she's talking about beyond wanting to have more say in terms of immigration and so forth. And in fact, she has talked about not following court decisions or federal laws that the Alberta legislature deems are unconstitutional. But today or yesterday has said that the government of Alberta will respect decisions made by the court. So it's not at all clear what will be in that Sovereignty Act. It looks like she's trying to soften it considerably now that she's premier. So trying to pivot from the language and the rhetoric of the campaign into something that's a little bit more palatable to the majority of Albertans, because she knows that polls indicate the majority of Albertans are not in favor of the Sovereignty Act as portrayed during the campaign. The risk, though, is that the supporters that brought her into office may be very angry if she does not sort of follow through on some of the things she said the Sovereignty Act would do.
Okay, Alberta political expert Laurie Williams. Laurie, thanks so much for making the time.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Wyatt.
For the latest on recovery efforts after Hurricane Fiona, I'm joined now by an Atlantic Canada MP who's also Minister for the Atlantic Canada Opportunities Agency. Minister, thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks so much for having me, Wyatt.
Let's just start out with the call from some provincial governments, in particular Nova Scotia, for some additional assistance from the federal government. What is the federal government prepared to do to assist the various provinces in Atlantic Canada to deal with some of the damages caused by Hurricane Fiona?
Well, first of all, as you know, I'm from Atlantic Canada, and our hearts certainly go out with everyone that's been affected by this storm. And we certainly know that there's some areas that have been partially affected. Some areas in the southeastern part of Brunswick, Prince Edward Island, several areas in Nova Scotia, including Cape Breton, and also in Newfoundland. So as a result, the federal government has indicated we would be there for Atlantic Canadians all the way through this process. And as soon as the storm, actually even before the storm was finished, we already reached out to our provincial colleagues to make sure that they knew that we were going to be there to help them. Immediately after the storm, we reached out to the premiers and also the municipal and local officials to see what the needs were on the ground. And immediately the Army was called in because they certainly needed some assistance with clearing the debris and doing some wellness checks and the rest of it. And now moving forward, we continue to assess the needs on the ground, but also making sure that the financial supports are there for the rebuilding.
And when you look at that rebuilding in Atlantic Canada, in Newfoundland, Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and New Brunswick didn't seem to be affected necessarily as hard as some of the other provinces in Atlantic Canada, but still partially, according to their premier. But when you look at how each of the individual provinces were hit and affected by this disaster, how will the federal government assess that in terms of which factors might play into how they assist the provinces further?
Well, first and foremost, we have some existing programs, some financial assistance program. One of them is called the Disaster Funding Application Fund. And as a result of that, the provinces are the ones that actually make the request to the federal government. The only thing they have to do, they do the assessments on the ground to see what the needs are with respect to the damage that's been caused. And the federal government will be there to provide assistance to the provinces up to 90% of the cost of the damages. So aside from that, this week, as well, as you're aware, we announced an additional $300 million fund, the Hurricane Fiona Recovery Fund. And that fund is not to duplicate any existing programs, Wyatt. It's really to make sure that we have this money that's available to fill in the gaps. So if individuals, businesses don't qualify for the existing programs like the DFAA, as we like to refer to it, the Disaster Funding Program, we'll have this additional funding that will be able to provide further assistance to folks. So again, we first of all want to say to individuals, it's really important that the provinces use the DFAA fund, the Disaster Relief Fund. But then from there, we've also put in place this additional program to make sure that if there's any additional funds that are needed, that the federal government will be there to help along the way.
All right, Minister Jeanette Petitpas-Taylor. Minister, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Wyatt.
Over the course of the Thanksgiving long weekend, a lot of concerns surrounding COVID-19 were risen. It was the first major holiday that you could say was more normal than holidays past, but nevertheless, it did still spark some conversations about how major events like that should go forward and where COVID-19 really is at from here. Joining me now to discuss that and more is Dr. Supriya Sharma, Chief Medical Advisor at Health Canada. Dr. Supriya Sharma, thanks so much for making the time. Let's just start out with that piece that I mentioned What do you make as to where we're currently at in the fight against COVID-19, specifically when looking at, vaccination numbers and the rate at which Canadians are getting vaccinated?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of where we are with respect to the pandemic, certainly, we're in a phase where we're heading into the fall and winter months, which is traditionally a time where we do see increases in all sorts of respiratory viruses. COVID is one of them. So I think, the concern as we go forward is really what is going to happen as we head into this time where people are spending more time inside and potentially we have more virus circulating, which is why we're saying, how important it is for people to have their vaccines and be up to date with those vaccinations, because vaccines really are, a key part of our public health response to COVID-19. They really offer good protection around what matters most, which is prevention of severe illness, hospitalization, and death from COVID. But that really depends on making sure that people are up to date. So, want to make sure that people have their vaccines, they know when they need to get their boosters and how that'll sort of serve them well as we head into this fall season. It's not the only strategy, of course, that we have. We really look at public health measures as different layers to help protect ourselves and those that are around us. But vaccination certainly is a really key part of that strategy.
And you mentioned, the fall going into the winter. We're now well into the fall, and in a few months, we will officially be into the winter. How concerned are you that we might see an uptake in the number of COVID cases over the winter months if, say, we don't see the vaccination numbers that we need to?
So we're starting to see it already. So in some places, in Canada, we're starting to see a bit of an uptick in a lot of places with respect to COVID cases. We're seeing increases in numbers in Europe and increases in hospitalization. It's a bit of, I kind of refer to it as a variant or a subvariant soup out there. We're not quite sure which one might emerge to kind of drive the next wave. So I think we're all watching very carefully. If we had a crystal ball and knew exactly what was going to happen with COVID-19 as we move forward, I think that would be wonderful. But we don't. We're really learning as we go with respect to this virus, and we're seeing a lot of changes in variants. So that's again, we're lots of monitor going on, and that's why we're really saying go in and get vaccinated. We also think that this might be a fairly severe flu season. We've had very low case numbers over the last couple of years with respect to flu. Our hypothesis is that it's because we've had public health measures in place. But when we look to other places like Australia or other places in the Southern Hemisphere, they had a rougher flu season this past season than they've seen before. So that's the other thing, is that we're starting to roll out the flu vaccines. So for people, especially if they're at higher risk, to make sure that they get their flu vaccination as well.
Okay, Dr. Supriya Sharma, Chief Medical Advisor at Health Canada. Dr. Supriya Sharma, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks for your interest.